words about the Office of Christian Integration, and then I'll introduce our speaker today, Dr. Karen McGibbon. On behalf of myself and Dr. Kara Cochran as co-chairs of integration here at Richmont, integration is the term we use here to refer to how we relate truths we apprehend from Christian theology and spirituality with the theory and practice of clinical mental health, counseling, and psychology. And our first and deepest commitment as a Christian institution and given the history of Richmont is through our ecumenical Christian heritage and worldview to Christ, which compels us to discern truth wherever it may be found. And the Office of Christian Integration exists to facilitate conversation, connection, and critical thinking regarding the ways in which Christian theology and spiritual formation and clinical mental health coalesce and influence the lives of all the stakeholders of our community. I'm very pleased today to welcome Dr. Karen McGibbon with us, who is going to be speaking today about a recent Doctor of Ministry thesis she completed called Theologically Informed Counseling, Developing a Theology Course for Clinical Counseling Students. Dr. Karen McGibbon is Assistant Professor of Clinical Counseling at Weinbrenner Theological Seminary in Ohio. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology, a Master's in Pastoral Psychology and Counseling, and a PhD in Counselor Education and Supervision. And as I say, also a Doctor in Ministry. She's a certified life coach, a licensed professional counselor in Jamaica and Ohio, and a nationally certified counselor. And I had the privilege to be one of the subjects she got to interview for her thesis. So I'm really, really delighted with the expertise she brings with our PhD aspirations here at Richmont, but also the Doctor of Ministry that we have. It's just wonderful to have someone who sits at the same intersections. So without further ado, Karen, I will let you take it away and share with us what you have. Thank you so much for coming today.
And thank you so, oh my goodness. Thank you so much to Preston, Dr. Hill, for asking me to present what I found in this labor of love, which you all will hear a lot about. This theologically informed counseling paper that I wrote, I didn't understand the value and importance of it when I began the process, but I can tell you, I am quite convinced that this was the right thing to do at the right time. And I hope you hear that as I share my story with you. So thank you all for coming to be with us while we look at this very interesting study. So the call. So we as Christians commonly use this term. And when I thought about trying to explain to those of you who don't know me, why would you want to do another doctorate to focus it in this area? And there's definitely a process that God took me through that I didn't understand what he was doing. I thought if I shared it a little with you, you would get it. So my entry into the counseling, let's say, profession began as a minister where I participated in the counseling ministry of my church. That's when I first started to see the impact that counseling could have on someone's life. And then that was pre-studies. I thought of studying counseling formally because it really connected with me. And the direction I went in was, I started in a ministry setting. Why not continue learning about counseling, but keeping God in mind as I did so? So it began at a seminary where I now had to, as you heard, transition from having a marine biology degree into how do I now get into the counseling field? And so I had to do courses at a seminary. I transitioned to a graduate school of theology. So that was in Jamaica, where I'm from. You may hear my accent, and it's okay. I am Jamaican. It's okay to ask. So from the graduate school of theology, I had done courses there or completed them at a Bible college in Canada. And that's where I got my master's in pastoral psychology and counseling. And of course, the pastoral side of it connected with me again, because I just saw myself as a minister and I want to equip myself. And then I loved the research. So that master's that master's program, we were required to write a thesis, which not all master's programs do. And so I was able to do research at that level, and it was so fascinating to me that I wanted to do more. And that's really what led me to further studies. I didn't want to stop researching. And that's why I found another degree program, a PhD, in a faith-based institution that would allow me to conduct further research. Now, other normal people just go and do research and write articles, but I thought, why not get another degree? That degree, the PhD, really changed me, because I think that's where I learned what integration was. It was a university in the United States, CACREP accredited. So they were really focused on, let's do what CACREP is asking us to do very well. And I believe they did. By the time I finished my PhD, integration was just normal. I didn't know any different. In my mind, there is spiritual component to the needs that we're trying to meet with our clients. They might not know it or say it initially, but we have to be prepared to meet them. And that was just so ingrained in me by then, that when I was able to be hired in the United States based on that degree and started to teach clinical counseling in a seminary, I just did what I had learned. And I just presented to my students the things that I just took for granted. And that's when it occurred to me, not my colleagues, they were not trained. They didn't have that background. And for me, just talking about integration and being able to comfortably answer questions about how do you integrate your faith, I didn't realize it was not common. Let's put it that way. But as I continued teaching those students who kept asking about integration, and I told them, you know, this is just what I do. It's really very just part of who I am. It's not overt. And I just kept telling them that in the seminary environment, they came there on purpose because they wanted the faith component, they wanted theology. And so we gave it to them. That's part of the requirement for our students. But unfortunately, what they were receiving was designed and taught by theologians. And I say unfortunately, because they couldn't get it. There was a rare student who was able to go into a class, systematic theology class, etc., and really understand what they were saying. And I remember that was my process. I had to do that too. I had to study theology too. And I was always dying for the theology course to end because I just didn't know what they were saying. And I felt so dumb. Okay. However, believe it or not, my first interest in further studies at the master's level was in biblical studies. That's where my heart was. But I didn't like how I felt whenever theology was part of what was being taught. I didn't understand what they were saying. And theologians talk about, you know, ecumenical and ecclesiastical and whatnot. And clinical counselors don't always follow very well. Thus, my students struggle. And I distinctly recall one class with my internship students where they cried because they had to take a theology course that we told them they have to take. And they did not know what they were doing, and they assumed they would fail. Having had a 4.0 GPA before, they struggled. And I felt so bad because they chose us, and we were giving them what we thought they wanted. And I had that same experience, and I knew what they meant. And that's what led me, when I had already decided to do a doctorate, because my wonderful, wise colleague said, if you're going to study again, why not just get a doctorate? It's the same length of time instead of the master's. You'll be able to teach in the, you know, theology program. Said, okay, but I didn't know what to choose as my focus. And I know this is sounding long, but you'll understand why I had to say this much. Because when we were becoming CACREP accredited, the person in charge of the team, he said, there's a bridge that you guys need to find here between your clinical counseling and theology program. And two of my colleagues, they cornered me during that same process and said, you're the bridge. And that's when I knew this is what I was supposed to do. Find a way to bring the two together. Now, let me proceed. That's why when I acknowledged that our students were not competently transitioning from clinical counseling to theology, it was clear that it's two different ways of thinking, two different languages. They just couldn't quickly do it, maybe if given more time, but they just could not easily connect the two. And then they started to question what we were telling them they needed. They started to question these courses that we said, if you do not complete them successfully, you cannot graduate. And so their whole sense of worth, their ability to use their faith in their profession was jeopardized, and it just wasn't right. And that's why something had to be done. Now, I know that there are courses that other degree granting institutions, theology courses, they offer their clinical counselors. I see them and they're great. But guess what? Those were designed by persons who just intuitively felt, okay, this is what our students need. Let me give it to them and hope that they feel like they're prepared. We want to prepare our students for the clinical world and everything that their clients may bring. But where was the evidence behind this is the best way to do it? To date, I haven't found any such course, and that made it absolutely necessary to at least see if what was out there, what other persons felt and saw that was missing, if I could put my finger on it and use that information to give to our students and say, what about this? So the problems that I was seeking to address were, one, students look forward to learning theological concepts, but they don't easily translate those into, okay, I'm now working with someone who's struggling, they have a theological issue. How do I help them? Problem two, our students have limitations in their ability to grasp theological concepts because they just think differently. It's just a different part of your brain. And they also bring strengths, but how do we tap into those? We weren't really addressing them. We were just saying, here, do this, that's it. So just two problems, but I'm sure you can imagine some more. Let me just tell you a little bit of what I saw out there. I saw Eric Johnson, who anybody who is interested in integration would know about. And he felt some very important things. He said the Bible has ultimate authority over all of psychology and soul care and is the most significant source of knowledge about human beings and their psychospiritual problems. So clearly, the Bible needs to be a part of whatever we're trying to teach our student, not just as a devotional. Then, if we look at polls, if we look at what people want, what they're missing, Americans, this is just Americans, but I'm pretty sure it translates all over the world. At least 75% of them in 2021 self-identify with some type of religion. And we are preparing our counselors to help them. So why aren't our counselors competent to do so? And then if we look at, okay, so what are the standards? What are the expectations of these counselors that we are training? And a survey, they put together competencies that they said your students need to have these. And there is a way to ethically integrate religion and spiritually into counseling. Your students need to be comfortable with it. Please note the word I keep using. It doesn't mean they can't do it, but if you think about it, if you've ever been with a client that's struggling, you're not going to quickly jump to the technique or the intervention that you don't feel comfortable with, especially if they're in distress. And that's what was missing. And so when I did this research, I knew I had to hear voices. I knew that I couldn't just do some surveys and say yes, no, maybe so. I had to do a phenomenological research study. I had to enter lives. I had to hear experiences. And the persons I selected and who were sent to me, thank God, were persons who have also trained clinical counselors and have been exposed to theology and do want to train their counselors better, and also felt like they may have benefited from better training in theology. So I designed an interview with questions that related to age, ethnicity, practice, setting, and focus. And I probed deeply. These were people who were supervising. These were people who were practicing. These were people who were teaching. And I think I successfully probed with my questions to find out what's missing for you, what was missing for you, what currently is, what do you want to see, so that I could try to bring all their voices together and create something that they felt proud of. So, who did I interview? I think I did a good job with getting diversity in there. 5 men, 5 women. Look at the age range. All licensed mental health professor or counselors with wide-ranging lengths of practice. 9 worked in private practice, 1 in a medical counseling setting of the private practice, 1 was community mental health, 2 in college counseling, 5 in faith-based settings, 5 worked in non-faith-based organizations, all graduated from evangelical institutions where they had some kind of introduction to a Christian worldview in counseling, 4 also possessed undergraduate or graduate level degrees in theology or biblical studies. Now, what were my research questions? 3 of them. 1, how will the study of theology facilitate the integration of faith and practice for clinical counseling students? 2, what content should be considered for inclusion in a theology course for clinical counseling students? 3, what design framework, format, or structure would best fit the content chosen for a clinical counseling theology course? Now, keep in mind when I designed these 3 research questions that I knew that theological issues of clients are not limited by the ACA Code of Ethics, but are instead accommodated and encouraged in the context of holistic health and healing. So with this in mind, the questions needed to be answered to say, okay, how do we do this ethically? And one thing I can tell you, those research questions brought out themes that I could tell during the interview process what they were. I'm very, very grateful because I understand that one of the challenges of qualitative research is finding out those themes and being faithful and using integrity in stating what they are. And I can tell you, I heard them so clearly because my interview subjects were essentially all saying the same thing. And that was when I started to know how important what I was doing was, that I was in effect gathering information that existed all this time. And there just was not that avenue for it. So in response to research question 1, How will the study of theology facilitate the integration of faith and practice for clinical counseling students? Theme 1 emerged. I cannot do this work apart from God. My subjects really felt that God's input in their ability to help clients was key. They also felt that in their practice, integrating faith was mainly implicit. Essentially, who they were as people of faith was covertly influencing the way they worked with clients. It was just a part of them. It was just who they were, who God had designed them to be. When I asked the research question, what content should be considered for inclusion in a theology course for clinical counseling students, theme 3 emerged. Prioritize experiential, reflective, and discussion-based coursework. My subjects felt like students need to have somewhere that they can, one, talk about the theological issues that, one, they're hearing there maybe in the sites they're in as interns bring to them, or they may themselves have and have never felt like someone is there to be able to say, okay, here I'm hearing this psychological issue, I'm hearing this theological issue, let's see what we can do with them so that you can get the help that you need. Under that same question, theme 4 emerged. Prioritize diversity. My subjects felt in the world that we live in, the people who we serve are wide and varied. They believe various things. Unfortunately, Christians sometimes believe that because, and I am not disagreeing with you here, the only way is through Jesus Christ. There's no doubt in my mind about that. Not everybody else believes that. We can't put that on people. And we know that that's an ethical issue. But I'm trying to say there are people who aren't there yet. I'm trying to say there are people who are heading there. There are people who may never get there, but they have God issues and they need somebody to talk to about them. And that's the thing. Our students have to be prepared to hear all manner of things and to meet their clients there. Research question number 3. What design, framework, format, or structure would best fit the content chosen for a clinical counseling theology course? 2 themes emerged. Deep connections and passionate instruction produce favorable learning outcomes. They want professors who are passionate about their subject matter. They do not want professors who read from a text or quote from a text and say, okay, that's your lesson for today. They want people who say, oh, I remember when I struggled and God met me and I realized that I was in a deep depression and I had to resolve the incongruence I felt with God is good and I'm struggling so that I could find healing. They want people who can talk to them that way. When they have those conversations, they remember. They don't just remember what they read, they remember what they heard. They remember what their professor felt and expressed. Also, theme 6, utilized a clinical counseling trained theology professor. Why? Because we are preparing our students to work with clinical issues. I so appreciate what theology brings to the world, the study of it. I so appreciate those theological conversations until they really get too complicated. I so appreciate the fact that theology and psychology should not be separated. But the person who teaches this course has to be able to meet those students in the counseling room and to tell them, this is what you should do. This is the ethical approach to addressing that theological issue. It cannot be someone who has not had that training, or else what we're trying to teach our students, they will not receive it. They have to be able to help their clients. They have to be able to walk with their clients to a place of healing. Now, the implications. When we're thinking, those of you who are counselor educators, of what to do in the classroom, let's face it, the training of clinical counseling students should endorse spirituality as a mental health component that should be treated with respect and curiosity. I also happen to be the multicultural counseling professor at the institution I teach at. Spirituality is a multicultural component, people, okay? We have to do it. Look at what Kay Greb says, it has to be done. And so we cannot afford to devalue spirituality as a mental health component. And so we must not just acknowledge it, but emphasize it. If you just think back to the pandemic year, where everybody had a theological issue, as far as I'm concerned, we had one, our clients had one, everybody had one, because God was allowing people who were young and strong to die. How do you not ask the question, why? Then in our classrooms, we have to have discussion. We have to talk about these things. We have to hear a person's point of view and say, that's a great point. Let me look into that and really talk through, when do ethical violations begin and end? What are your values? What are their values? How do you bring those together in a respectful and ethical way? We have to talk. Then, required reading. It must include one or more texts written by professionals who have qualifications and expertise in both disciplines. We have to expose our students to both in a meaningful way. We have to allow them to read the words of persons who understand that psychology and theology should not be separated. There are more. Recommended texts should provide case study examples. Why? Because what do we do with our interns? We conceptualize and conceptualize and conceptualize. My internship students, what does their syllabus say? Case conceptualization, that's what we do. Why? Because they need the experience, they need the feedback, they need their peer input, they need their professor to challenge, to address, to correct. They have to do it. That's what we're training them to do. So we need case studies. And I am pretty sure that if I was to ask some of my students for case studies, just to help a professor out, hey, I need some case studies, they would have so many. A lot of our students are pastors and they have a lot. And so this is what we need to be talking about in that class. Then there is the exciting experiential learning opportunity. Now, immersion. Now, as a multicultural professor, immersion has to be an assignment. And guess what? I mean, that's life-changing. I will never get tired of hearing, by the way, if you hear a screaming sound, that's my granddaughter. She does not understand that she needs to be quiet right now, okay? When my students do their immersion assignment, it changes them. Anybody who has taught that course, it changes them. It changed me when I had to do those. Twice I took a multicultural. And that changed me. This is a perfect way to allow persons to see through the eyes of someone who does not have the same perception of God as you do. I mean, it's really easy to judge. A lot of us judge secretly. We judge every day. But really, how biased are we? Do we know? If each of you wonderful Christians were to go to a temple and listen to Allah stuff, how would you feel? If would it, could you appreciate it? Could you empathize? Could you support? Immersion, absolute necessity. Finally, implications. Once licensed counselors may and should develop professional relationships through supervision, consultation, other types of peer interactions with persons who practice or endorse unfamiliar religious traditions. Get comfortable with it. Listen to them, listen to how they support their clients, listen to how they supervise their students. Find new ways of practicing. Thus, recommendation 1, the theology course created as a result of this study can provide a good framework for understanding the effectiveness of the process of training students in spiritual integration. 2, student surveys that are typically completed at the end of each course, if carefully designed, should provide valuable information about the effectiveness of the course in helping students think theologically. 3, theology professors in faith-based clinical counseling programs are encouraged to explore opportunities to be trained and further exposed to clinical counseling concepts and applications. 4, clinical counseling professors who desire to teach theology in faith-based clinical counseling programs are encouraged to pursue theological studies through courses, seminars, and workshops as a part of their professional development. The conclusion. This study gave voice to the experiences of Christians who are clinical counselors, who feel called to the counseling profession, and who are committed to serving their community with their faith as a resource. They were all convinced that there is a better way to prepare counselors in training who profess similar convictions to advocate for faith-informed clinical counseling. It is hoped that the theology course informed by this research will serve as a significant step forward on the journey to ethical and effective spiritual integration. And for those of you who I didn't tell the exciting news to already, I will begin teaching that course at the end of April. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGibbon. That was so rich. We appreciate you bringing this to us. So now I'll remind everyone that we have your videos disabled for recording reasons, for FERPA reasons, so that we can share this video beyond the bounds of our community here. But I do want to invite you to put questions in the chat if you have them. And I'll go ahead and start with a question for you, Dr. McGibbon. And that is, you mentioned, I think, one of the themes that emerged was something about having faculty in these programs who are essentially, I think you called them clinically trained theology professors. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, the economics of higher academia, theology and religious studies and other humanities scholars that may come from a faith-based perspective, they're actually struggling quite a bit, and those departments are shrinking. And a lot of seminaries I know are actually pivoting to offering clinical mental health counseling degrees just to help their institution like survive basically economically. And I'm just wondering to hear more about like what would it look like for a theology professor or for someone who is trained not in the clinical world, but someone who is trained in the world of theology or philosophy or Bible, for them to become a a clinically trained or to develop that kind of bilingual voice to be able to speak to counselors. Like what kind of skills or what kind of like it seems like a unicorn. Like how do you find that kind of person and what does it look like for there to be a clinically trained theology professor? And how is that different from, you know, a counselor educator who has spiritual or theological interests?
Well, thank you so much for your question, Dr. Hill. And that one, I think that's almost everybody's thought. Um, I think you're a unicorn, to be honest. And that's one of the reasons I was glad I met you, because what it told me is there are persons who do have that overlap of interest. I just didn't have the equivalent training at the time. And it's like something is missing and you don't stop looking till you find it. I think the biggest challenge I feel is that people don't always have access to the opportunities like I did to be able to study further to the degree that I did. They have the interest, but not the opportunity. I happen to work with a couple theologians who they really have a heart for counseling. You know it, you hear it. It may have come from a pastoral place, but they are also fascinated by clinical things. And what I think, if I was to imagine a theology professor teaching this course, I would imagine that they should with guidance. So maybe from someone like me who knows what it should look like. Um, why not just do some mental health course training? So the thing that will be key here in helping these students is the case study component. It's really being able to look at what this case presents and to see, to discern. I feel like it's not impossible for someone who hasn't gone all the way to a final degree. Maybe if you had a degree in psychology alone and then you did some of those CEU kinds of trainings, which I think are pretty good, you would have that, let's say, comfort, aptitude. But I really feel like it would be better if it is someone who has a theology degree or specialization who has those courses under their belt. I think it would be better a team teaching approach. Why not? They take the beginning of the class where we really do talk through theological issues and then invite guest persons to come in for the second half of the class where there are more case studies, case studies, case studies. I mean, this class, I'm going to be teaching it remotely. That person could be anywhere in the world, not just the United States. They may have expertise that would benefit. It could be more than one person. Can you come in for this class? We'll be talking about this themed case study. We would love your input. And they come in, and then the theology professor is able to say, from where I sit, this is what I see and hear. And then the clinically trained person can say, however, based on the diagnosis, this is really how you would proceed. Isn't that something that could be worked out? We just have to be creative.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me of a class we have here at Richmont called Theodicy and Trauma Counseling. And often we'll have one professor who's more theologically based or trained do the theodicy portion, and then another one go into the trauma counseling and the traumatology. So
Right.
I think it is possible. And that kind of relates to a second question, which I would just love to hear. Could you say a few words about what the class is like? that you're teaching. So what is that class like? How did you choose to construct it? Because you basically took all this data and said, okay, let me go make a class now. So what's that class like, and what's the content, and what books are assigned? And I would just love to hear about it.
Sure. So imagine the surprise of my program director and dissertation chair when I said, "Oh, didn't you know that the syllabus is one of my appendices?" I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that. So yeah, I did put it together. And as I said, that's really what this was all about for me. I remember reflecting on the process when I almost dropped out, thinking, Karen, at the end of this, everybody's just going to call you Dr. McGibbon anyway. It's not like before where you got all excited about being doctor. It's like, you're still doctor. There's no big deal here. Then I thought, oh, but if I could just create that course and teach it. So yes, this course I am proud of, haven't taught yet. So I guess my students' response will help me to feel proud or not at the end of the process. But I will mention that I'll mention what the textbooks are. One by Jennifer Baldwin, Trauma Sensitive Theology, Thinking Theologically in the Era of Trauma. Then, of course, we can't not have a pocket dictionary of theological terms, because did you hear me say that clinical counselors really can't get engaged with you theologians in those conversations? Then, Miss Dr. McMinn, how could we leave him out? Psychology, Theology, and Spirituality in Christian Counseling. That's the main text. It's really a fantastic text if you want content for a course like this. And finally, a more reflective text, Grace for the Afflicted, a clinical and biblical perspective on mental illness. I felt like all of those, if my students don't get what I'm trying to give them with all of that rich literature, then maybe I did something wrong. So that was the text. Then I'm pleased to announce my students will write a theology of clinical counseling paper. They will have to come up with some type of statement on theology of clinical counseling and what does that look like for them. We will have discussion boards every other week where they will get to richly bring other articles they've read, etc., just richly dissect the issues that we bring. And I think that's really important because students don't believe me initially, but I was that student in class who never spoke up because I'm actually shy. And so I had a lot of thoughts and views that I just wasn't comfortable to share in a live discussion. But if you gave me a written discussion, that's when you would know. And that's what that is there for, to facilitate the richness of the discussion that some students may not be able to do in class. Then, theological immersion experience. Our students are going to have to 3 times at a minimum visit some type of faith expression of some type of belief system that is not theirs and is not comfortable. And that was directly taken from the model of my multicultural counseling class. And they're going to have to go to those meetings, listen to what people say and look at how they behave, write a reflection in a journal form. And they're now going to take what they have heard and seen and write how would you work with a client, like a scholarly document. How would you work with a client from this faith perspective, with references, etc. They're also going to present case studies. So the second half of the class will have them, each one of them will be responsible for a case that they will have to take from beginning to end, similar to what interns do. And then the last, so this is no light course, the last thing is a theological reflection paper. So not just a statement on what their theology of clinical counseling is, but they're going to have to talk about things that in this class, for example, or incidents in their lives that challenge their view of God, themselves as a person of faith, and others. And those are the main highlights of the class. This is a course that should not be offered early in the program. It should be at least a second year. They should have done diagnosis and treatment to be able to do justice to this course.
That's so rich. It makes so much sense. I wish I could take it.
I know you can.
I'll sign up. I'll go sign up now. Well, it really sounds wonderful. And we have, one more question, and then we'll let everyone head out so that they have time to run to their next appointments. But final question here: what do you think an introductory course might look like, given that the one you described there is, needs more footwork and grounding? What would a more early sort of theologically informed course look like?
Now I have to think on my feet. But I will say I love the theological reflection process. I think for me, once I understood what was being asked of me, I feel like once you do justice to a paper like that, growth happens. I think an introductory course for any clinical counseling student, they don't need to be an expert in theological studies to be able to really be honest with themselves about theological issues, where they're at, essentially documenting their journey. And so that course should have that as an assignment. And it could be a big assignment. I feel like they should have rudimentary introduction to the basic. Let me tell you what some of the topics in the course are: prayer, scripture, sin, confession, forgiveness, redemption. Those are topics that just should have some kind of introduction to the theology of these things. We need to know as clinical counselors, what does that mean? What's a theology of prayer? What's a theology of scripture? How do these things matter? There's also the final topic for this course is mental illness and the church. I think it would be appropriate to have a topic like that. So I would say take out the clinical parts and put in the theological parts, but challenge students, maybe theological reflection people, and maybe one case study paper assignment. Choose a theological issue, create, if you want, a case or get somebody's real life experience, do some research. How would you work with this client? Just to introduce them to the idea.
That's so wonderful. Well, I am so grateful again. Thank you, Dr. McGibbon, for all you've brought to us. This is rich and so wonderful. And to all the participants, we'll be sending out an email with the recording. And Dr. McGibbon has kindly offered to share with us PDF of the PowerPoint, or it's not a PowerPoint, actually, it's a Canva.
Yes.
We'll have that resource available to you all. And on behalf of everyone who's been here today, I express my thanks to you. And people have loved what you've brought. We're so grateful for the connection. And don't forget, everyone, that in the fall, we've got more integration seminars coming. The speakers for that will be coming out soon. And in the meantime, hope you all have a very happy Eastertide. So we'll be dismissed at this point. Thank you, everyone. And Graham, you can feel free to end the recording.